and speaking about this idea of taking a new and expanded look at some of the resources we're used to using with our students and children. So I'm going to share my screen here with all of you. Okay. I'm assuming you can see everything okay? You see my slides? And we'll go ahead and get started. So, in terms of diversifying the feast, my goal is to find beauty through culturally rich learning. So, I want to give you a little background as to how I arrived at this place. I haven't always seen education in this way. I haven't always, it hasn't always been a goal of mine to find diverse voices and beautiful perspectives from many different types of people. Not because I rejected that idea, but because I never had the idea. I only knew to give my children the education that I had been given, and nothing else came about. But as I went down that path of showing my children and exposing them to wonderful works of literature and art and other resources, I began to hear from my kids. And some of the things that I started to hear were quite disturbing, particularly with my oldest daughter. This was some years ago. She was a young girl. And one day she said to me, Mommy, there's that the people like us have never done anything and we don't really know anything. And I said, well, what would make you say that? And she said, because you said that we learn about important people in school and we only learn about white people. And I immediately realized that I was doing my child a disservice, not by the things I was sharing and the things that I was saying, because the books we were reading and the things we were using were absolutely stunningly beautiful, but rather it was what wasn't being said and the things that I wasn't sharing with her that were speaking volumes. So it brings me to an interview I saw with Ezra Jack Keats, the author of The Snowy Day. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And he was a white author, but he wrote this series of books about this little boy, Peter. If you aren't familiar with it, Peter has such a beautiful time playing outside, and he gets a snowball, and he's so excited about it that he brings it home in his pocket to keep. And you can imagine what happened. And the interviewer asked Ezra Jack Keats, why would you choose to write a story about this little black boy and his family, his mom and his family? I mean, it's kind of an odd thing. Nobody else is writing stories about people like that. And, I'm kind of leaning in close to like continue seeing what this guy said. And I thought it was going to be this big, dramatic, fancy answer. And instead, he simply said, well, because they always should have been there. And that's the main theme that I want you to take away from my talk today. This isn't a big statement or something, it has nothing to do with politics. It's not something that I want to make a point about. I'm not standing on grandstanding on it, but simply suggesting that we return to our children's studies in their world, the things that should have always been there. As she mentioned, I am a lover of Charlotte Mason philosophy, and there is a lot of overlap. I find when I'm situated among friends and in this community, I see that like-mindedness of the practitioners and the people that are attracted to traditional classic approach and the Charlotte Mason approach as well. So I want to share, for those of you who aren't as familiar with her work, some of the principles that she brings about, or things that she's mentioned in her work or that have been mentioned about her in the work of her colleagues, to help ground you in what I'm going to talk about today. So Essex Chumley wrote in the Parents Review, which was a publication that was put out by Charlotte Mason's school that she managed in England in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And she said, it is part of every member to seek and find in his own mind the best means of applying those principles, that advice, to new occasions and to particular instances. We have no body of rules, no recipes. A few firmly rooted principles have been shown to us, and in these consist the strength and usefulness of the union, their organization. If in the study and expression of these principles we use our liberty, our best intelligence, our careful consideration, and our honest labor, we shall find a steadily growing power of meeting new difficulties, not by recipes old or new, but by vital truth. Okay, so she's saying that Charlotte Mason did not believe in giving a recipe, and I follow in that, and I think that many of you would agree with that. There isn't a strict recipe. You must do this then and say this there, or you must read this in this order at this time. There's much more art to it than that, and there is some say in which the guide or the teacher and the student and child themselves will be heading in a direction here or feel touched by a direction there, and as we have to use our freedom, our liberty, and our best intelligence and careful consideration when we're considering the resources that we learn from. In volume 3, she wrote 6 volumes. In volume 3, she said, I think we should have a great educational revolution once we ceased to regard ourselves as assortments of so-called faculties and realized ourselves as persons whose great business it is to get in touch with other persons of all sorts and condition, of all countries and climes, of all times, past and present. History would become entrancing. Literature a magic mirror for the discovery of other minds, the study of sociology, a duty and a delight. I think that presents a beautiful idea, a picture here that we can see for our children. That when we think about making it our business to get in touch with all sorts of people in many different areas and walks of life and across different categories, the way that we tend to categorize ourselves as humans, we will have a delightful feast on our hands. In volume 6, she said, perhaps the gravest defect in school curricula is that they fail to give a comprehensive, intelligent, and interesting introduction to history. We cannot live sanely unless we know that other peoples are as we are, with a difference, that their history is as ours, with a difference, that they too have been represented by their poets and their artists, that they too have their literature and their national life. So here we start seeing the groundwork being laid for this idea that literature and art are expansive. Poetry is expansive. There are people from all over the globe who have created based on their traditions and their stories, their philosophies, their artistic endeavors. And all of that is impacted by culture and geography and religion and time and place and space. In a Parents Review article, and again in the Parents Review publication associated with Charlotte Mason in 1914, E.A. Parrish wrote, rightly taught, every subject gives fuel to the imagination, and without imagination, no subject can be rightly followed. It is by the aid of imagination that a child comes to love people who do not belong to his own country. And as he learns the history of their great deeds and noble efforts, he's eager to learn something of the country in which they lived, of its shape and size, of its mountains, woods, and rivers, of the causes that made the people what they are. We English people, I am sorry to say, or for many of us, we could replace that with we American people, I'm sorry to say, have not usually the art of teaching our children to love other countries. And many of us think of foreign lands as we might think of a show at the White City, something that is there for us to look at, something that may rest us or divert us, but not something that stands as high, if not higher, than we do. We are still deluded by the idea that we may travel in a missionary spirit with civilization streaming from our garments. We must change something in ourselves before we can hope to do much for our children in this respect. And finally, something that she's known so well for saying in volume 6, Charlotte Mason said that education is a life. That life is sustained on ideas. Ideas are of spiritual origin, and God has made us so that we get them chiefly as we convey them to one another, whether by word of mouth, written page, scripture word, musical symphony. But we must sustain a child's inner life with ideas, as we sustain his body with food. So when we are presenting things from the canon and we are presenting materials and resources, what we really are giving to our children are ideas. And the source of those ideas are up for great consideration. So this idea of her making reference to food or the comparison to food is very meaningful to me. In my past life, I say I've done so many different jobs, but I am a registered dietitian, a nutritionist, and I specialized in working with people who were suffering from eating disorders and disordered eating. And things had gotten so bad with many of these girls and women that I worked with that they'd been admitted to inpatient psychiatric care, which is where they would see me. But some of them hadn't yet received an official diagnosis. But what they were suffering from is something known as orthorexia. Orthorexia is an unhealthy focus on eating in a healthy way. So eating nutritious food is really good, but if you have orthorexia, you obsess about it to such a degree that it can damage your overall well-being. Dr. Stephen Bratman, a California medical doctor, coined this term in 1996. It means fixation on righteous eating. Since then, many medical professionals have accepted the concept. It isn't an official diagnosis, but the basic idea is that it includes eating habits that reject a variety of foods for not being pure enough. Eventually, people with orthorexia begin to avoid whole meals that don't meet their standard. And rather than eating for sustenance and pleasure, everything becomes about food and control. If one has orthorexia, they may worry extensively about food quality, and this can lead to a lot of anxiety about what they're eating. They'll avoid going out to eat or avoid eating food prepared by others out of fear that the food that they don't prepare themselves won't meet their standards. They can refuse to eat a broad range of foods. It's normal for all of us to avoid some foods that we may not like the way they taste or feel, but with orthorexia, they will drop whole categories of food from their diet with no explanation whatsoever. They'll say that those foods are just simply not healthy. They also may be overly critical of their friends' food choices. So, what does any of this have to do with anything? Well, at times I think that those of us that appreciate the classical tradition and Charlotte Mason type of education can develop an unhealthy obsession with being purists according to our the most popular definitions. And I'm going to include myself in that as well. We obsess about the literature, the quality of the literature, who wrote it, what it says, and avoid reading any books that were written by people who are different than us or who aren't on the approved list of official and most important worthy classics. We refuse to consider art or music or poetry that aren't part of a traditional canon of study. And we can be overly critical of what our friends or other teachers, instructors, and parents in the tradition are doing with their children, especially when we think that they've strayed too far from our personal interpretations of beauty and goodness and truth. And to be honest, I think this is why so many of us struggle with diversifying the feast. It feels scary because in some ways we may feel that by including generous amounts of diverse voices from people of color into the carefully prepared meal plan, we'll adulterate it. And clearly, this is unhealthy thinking. And so, unsurprisingly, the best treatment for this mirrors the best treatment for orthorexia. One is exposure and response prevention. The more you're exposed to other types of beauty, the less anxiety it will cause, the less upsetting it will be to you. There's behavior modification, understanding the negative effects of your actions so you can actually begin to change what you're doing. Cognitive restructuring or cognitive reframing, which helps us to identify habits and beliefs that cause stress and replace them with less rigid thoughts and actions. And various forms of relaxation training, or as I like to tell when I'm teaching teachers, sometimes we need to take a chill pill in order to step back and see the big picture. So we have the freedom, as practitioners and parents and instructors to curate lessons that fit the needs of our specific families and classrooms set in various 21st century contexts. We have the responsibility to create or revise lessons that celebrate the unique cultures of our children and our families without condemning these other classic documents and books and other resources that we all do enjoy. And we have an expectation that we'll need to make some swaps in order to expand what our children are exposed to, because there are only, we each get 24 hours. That's how much we get. So all of the things that we're talking about today can't just always be added on to what we're already doing. The kids may start to drown. We as adults can only take in so much. So there needs to be a blending and a expansion that returns into what we consider normal and kind of redefining what we consider traditional based on what should have always been there. So I want to share with you some perspectives and views from my own context to show you what this has looked like in our home and in the cooperative, student-centered cooperative that I run in my hometown. So we'll look at 3 different ways that we can seamlessly integrate voices of color into our lessons. And these are 3 tools, I guess I would say, that we have at our disposal. The first is direct instruction. This is formally centering diverse stories as the main idea of a lesson. So an example could simply be reading Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington for history, or studying Edmonia Lewis for a picture study and examining the life of an artist. This is where most of us automatically go when we think about diversifying our lessons, and rightfully so. It's important to include direct instruction by prioritizing the need for our children to receive ideas. Remember, all of the books we're looking at and the resources and the things, they're really a packaging of ideas. It's important for our children to receive ideas from people of color and from women. We have adjacent instruction, which means we're including diverse voices related to the person or idea being studied. So an example would be on the left there, you see Never Caught, the story of Ona Judge. So when we're studying George Washington and the American Revolution, we would also study Ona Judge. She was an enslaved person who kind of self-liberated from Martha Washington. And they looked for her and chased after her for quite a while, but she was able to maintain her freedom. Or perhaps when we're reading about the journeys of Lewis and Clark out west, which is, there's so many complexities there, right? About how we see that westward expansion and the way we look at it. But we could also talk about York, who was an enslaved man that was a part of that expedition, and talk about what his contributions were to that trip, and what we can even talk about what would it mean, like how much would a person have to do to be able to feel that for someone to feel that they've earned the right to be free, because returning upon, when they returned back from that trip, despite how vital his experience was and how much he helped the expedition, he was not given his freedom upon return. So we also have indirect instruction. In this case, we're casually tying lessons and concepts that you're already covering to diverse people and ideas. So we're, in this case, it's not something that you may even be articulating to your students, but like playing music from a composer of color in the background during your school day or during meals, and casually mentioning who you're listening to. Going to a Shakespeare play, living in Atlanta, our Shakespeare house, it's called Shakespeare's Tavern. My girls were just there a couple weeks ago, actually watching a Jane Austen production. So it's mostly Shakespeare, but they do other productions as well. And this one is not from that theater. This is actually from a movie, Much Ado About Nothing, that was playing, I believe I saw that on PBS, but our stage productions can often look like this in Atlanta, and you have no idea how incredible it is for a group of students to sit down and to watch a production of a work that they know so intimately, to be performed by a diverse cast. It's very powerful. And for indirect instruction, the main idea or person in your lesson doesn't change. You're not going to read a different Shakespeare, a non-Shakespeare play. I mean, you may be doing that, right? But in this case, you're reading Shakespeare, right? Just like you normally would. Nothing is really going to change, but then you're going to go see this live production. And it's always so nice to cap off a study with a live production. And if the cast is diverse in this way, you're weaving them in seamlessly without ever needing to mention a thing to your students. And it's kind of the glue that brings an incredible amount of authenticity to what I'm suggesting that we do. We're just putting things out there that should have always been there. There's no reason why this would be jarring or surprising. That's our hope. So the three tools for diversifying lessons are direct instruction, adjacent instruction, and indirect instruction. So let's go through some very specific examples of what that may look like across different types of lessons. Again, I'm using examples from my home and my own context. It can vary vastly in your context or what you're planning. So these are just examples. So diversifying history lessons, all right? Let's start with nonfiction books. So rather than we don't use textbooks, but really topical nonfiction books, I wish I could find one that really told a beautiful story. I find it better for my purposes with my students to put together a kind of jigsaw puzzle of different nonfiction books that go very deeply and written by one passionate person on the topic of their choice, and to kind of put that together like a buffet for the children to enjoy and to really understand. So these nonfiction books offer plenty of opportunity for our students to see things in a different way. I'm not going to go through every book on these slides, but I want to point out, for example, All Times, All Peoples. I always start with that with my older students, and I say older elementary students, right, when they're moving from the primary years, because it's a world history of slavery. And it allows us to situate American slavery, American chattel slavery, within a worldview of slavery that has existed forever for all over the world in different ways and approaches. And this is very important because in American children can often grow up thinking that it's a purely an American thing. Now, the way that it was done here is a very American flavor, but the idea of enslavement is not a new thing, nor was it only an American thing. So I like to start with that. But there are books on so many different topics, Reconstruction, and we can go really deeply on the Underground Railroad, not just a paragraph or not just a kind of passing assumption that our students can deeply understand what that meant. But we have these beautiful books with photography and important information in them, written again by single passionate people, much different than, say, some of the books that we're used to reading. Historical fiction is some of my favorite. These are ways for our children to uh, get to know what's happening or what happened in history without the author necessarily being completely tied to only the strict interpretation based on original documents. And this can sometimes soften the blow for people. So I use an example oftentimes if I sit my children down and tell them, well, let me tell you what lynching was. And here's what it was. And here's a picture of what it looked like. And this is what had happened. And this is why and how. My children would be terrified. My young ones would be terrified. That's not a comforting or even interesting way to introduce someone to a complex and potentially devastating topic. But historical fiction, should they be reading, say, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and they understand what the character TJ did that led the mob to come to his home that night, and how Cassie Logan's father, even to his own demise, set his own property on fire to lure them away, because if one property burns, all the neighbors' property burns too, right? And so they all come running to help put out this fire, and that was his way of saving TJ from this, what seemed like an inevitable end. And in that way, the threat of lynching is exposed. The children are exposed to that. They understand what it is. They understand how it would happen, but it's couched in a story, and it's palatable, and it allows them to have an introduction to something very complex. I love historical fiction. Biographies. There's probably nothing else that will allow a child to be able to understand the time and place of that in which a person lived than a biography or an autobiography. They're absolutely fascinating ways of adding diverse perspectives to anything. And oftentimes when people tell me, well, I just don't know how to add these diverse perspectives. I don't know what to do, or I don't have the resources. Biographies are abundant. And at the very least, you can pick up a story about someone and allow your child to, or your student to get to know them through this story. And I like to tell people with our history studies, I tried for my children to get to know someone so well that if we were to run into this person, this historical figure in a crowd, we would know right away who it was. Not because necessarily just the way, not because of the way they look, but because of what they're doing and how they behave. And we intimately know them. Also, movies and documentaries. I feel like in classical world, everything, uh, a lot of the conversations make it seem as though we don't have electricity in our homes at times. And I think most of us have electricity in our homes, and children of today and students are using technology. And I think that we should take advantage of that and introduce them, depending on age appropriate movies and documentaries, some for learning, but some also for just general enrichment, again, with the goal of normalizing what should have always been. There's also this idea of performances. This is a shot of the Alvin Ailey Ballet. And if you've never been to the Alvin Ailey Ballet or the dance theater, of Harlem or some of these other very culturally distinct dance companies, then you would be in for a treat. And I suggest you look it up. This is a different approach to something that's very traditional. I always laugh and be like, it ain't the Nutcracker. And we love the Nutcracker. We think it's beautiful. We like to go every year. But there are other ways to open our children's eyes to things like the arts. The previous teacher talked about, the previous presenter today talked about what she felt a lot of the students, even high achieving students, are missing is this exposure and importance of the arts. Also, field trips. I don't usually call them field trips in my home because we're a family, so we don't usually say, oh, we're going on a field trip. But I think it's easiest for people to understand that best. When we choose where we go and how we spend our time with our students and our children, let's be very thoughtful about our field trips. So we like to visit the homes of former presidents, and people have told me before that is so weird. Why would you want to go to these places? And you know they were slaveholders and all of that. And to that, I say, I know. And how is there a better place for my children to learn about the state and of humanity, to learn about what it is to be human than standing in front of a slave cabin on a presidential plantation? It's a powerful. And I will say that I can't speak to how these places used to handle things. I'm sure it probably was abysmal. But in recent years, all of the ones we've been to up and down the East Coast have been phenomenal in their treatment of diverse topics. There is no one there trying to sugarcoat things. And they're also not being overly condemning. I would say something I write about in my book is that we are not to demonize or deify when we're teaching, right? Our students can think for themselves, but we are sharing stories and information. So you can get that through in the things that you do and where you visit as well. And it's not just with history. There are many other areas in which we can diversify the feast. And it is truly a feast. It extends beyond only books, but it includes books as well. Art, music, and poetry. So an example of direct instruction in art would be to study the work of Henry Ossawa Tanner, who is the artist of this picture, the banjo lesson, and so much more. That is a fascinating way to directly study the work of artists of color. Um, and there's adjacent instruction. So if we're studying Vincent van Gogh, you see his picture in the bottom left. When my children were studying him as an artist, and particularly the day we were looking at this painting, I also showed them that week this painting by Horace Pittman and one by Elizabeth Norse and this other painting by Henry Ossawa Tanner. And why would we not look at all of those? There's a story to be told here. What does it mean to gather around the table? Why is that such a common thing for artists to paint? What are they depicting? What can we guess from these people and their stances physically? What about the light and how the different artists use that, the colors they chose to use? When were these people painting? So I think that sometimes when I talk about diversifying the feast, people mistakenly think that I mean to get rid of all that we have studied that we find to be good. And I find that to be a convenient thing, right? Because that will shut me up. I'll just, ignore her. She wants to get rid of all the good things. But that's actually not true. I want to expand our thoughts on the things that are good. So my children do study Vincent van Gogh, but I want to expand the thoughts. He's not the only famous painter or artist who created a very light-centric piece of art with a group of people around a table. And let's talk about these other people as well. Someone once asked me during this presentation, they said, well, you obviously know a lot about art. I don't know anything about art, so I wouldn't know that these other pictures exist. And I want to stop and pause and remind everyone that I always say I am 3 nights ahead of my oldest child. I am not an artist. I did not major in art, and I'm not a history major. I'm 3 nights ahead, and oftentimes a quick search online will give you so much. So if you know you're going to study Vincent van Gogh, I'm looking at this picture that I'm going to share with my children tomorrow, and I just simply start looking for what other artist painted pictures similar to this and get to know them a little bit and speak to it. You don't have to be the purveyor of all knowledge. You're just dropping ideas as part of the feast, and the Holy Spirit is who will take that idea in your child and expand it and grow it and connect it to this like science of relations that will happen naturally. You don't have to weave that for them. So indirect instruction, this is sharing artistic styles and mediums of artists of color with your children as they pursue their own art lessons, or in our home, we call them handicrafts. So this is Augusta Savage on the right, a famous Black sculptor, and we studied her and her work. And then on the left, you see my daughters using their clay to sculpt their own creations. And there was no instruction that they had to do it to create something that Augusta Savage created or anything like that. The connection is simply having their hands in the clay, using it to make something in the same tradition as someone that we studied. So let's do that with music. With direct instruction, it would be studying the work of composers of color. Adjacent instruction, sharing compositions from people of color that are notably similar or different from the musicality or style of your chosen composer, or the music you're choosing to expose your students to. So in this case, the name of the book, this is actually a book, The Other Mozart, The Life of the Famous Chevalier de Saint-Georges. And there's also a movie that came out last year, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, about his life. The movie is not for kids, the book is, but you can watch the movie. And I don't prefer the name The Other Mozart. I kind of think that it's a lazy way to describe people at times when we compare them to someone else. It's been written that perhaps, many felt his music was even more impressive than Mozart's at the time. So it's a little bit of a ding, I think, to call him the other Mozart, but let's go with it because that's the name of the book. But when we studied Mozart in our home, we also studied the Chevalier. We learned about his life. We listened to compositions that he's created. We talked about where he came from, how he ended up in France, what kind of reception he received, what his relationship was with the French bourgeoisie, and how the French Revolution impacted him and his life and his work. Oops. And indirect instruction, that's just sharing versions. An example would be sharing versions of hymns or folk songs that are sung by people of color. We sing hymns in our homeschool every morning, and we don't always listen to the same type of person singing them or the same style of music. And so I remember being at a homeschool event and putting on a hymn and doing a hymn study with the audience. And I could tell by the looks on people's faces, they were absolutely stunned because they ain't never heard a song like that. And that's a beautiful thing. And I want our children to hear the the praise and worship of our Lord and Savior in so many, many different beautiful ways and across faith traditions. Let's move on to poetry. I think you guys are getting the idea, but a direct instruction in poetry would simply be reading about the lives and work of diverse poets, right? An adjacent instruction would be to pull a poem with a similar theme or style from a poet of color alongside your reading or study of a different poet that you may be studying in that time period. And indirect instruction, we use poetry as recitation in our home. So the children, each child will have their own poem that they read each day out loud to the rest of us. And you know, they don't have to memorize it, but they often end up memorizing it because they read it so many times. And the idea is simply to recite it well, read it beautifully. Read this poem in a way that will captivate an audience. And so indirect instruction for us is just choosing a poem from a person of color. This one is written by Effie Lee Newsom. Historians feel that she is the first Black woman to ever have written a volume of poetry specifically for children. She lived and worked during the Harlem Renaissance period. Other opportunities, we could talk about Bible. This picture is from the Jesus Martha series, where all the Bible stories that are depicted in these paintings are using people of color. This was used as a way to bring the gospel to these people after research that found that oftentimes people will feel like the gospel is for them when they can see themselves in it. And as we know, none of the painting depictions that we see from anyone can be declared completely accurate. We don't have photography, right? But as much as we can, traditionally, when we see biblical paintings and pictures, they will all have white people. And as inaccurate as that may be, or that is, it can just as easily be pictured, the story can easily be pictured with other people. I think it helps our children. I personally like to mix it all up with different people and kind of say, it doesn't really matter. That's not actually the point of the story, but I do like for them to have a visual that lets them know, expose them to all of God's people. Geography, this is one of the most obvious places to infuse people of color and how they live. Geography is the study of places, but it's also the study of the relationships between people and their environments. So a lot of times people think of the physical properties of the Earth's surface, but that's only half of geography. It's also about the human societies that are spread across those physical properties, or the mountains and the rivers and the land. That's geography, mapping, that's part of it. But the people, that's what makes geography come alive. Geography seeks to understand where things are found and why they're there and how they develop and change over time. So this is a beautiful place to bring in lots of imagination and ideas for our children. Charlotte Mason said that the peculiar value of geography lies in its fitness to nourish the mind with ideas and to furnish the imagination with pictures. That's what she said, and I think that's a really neat way to think of geography. So again, I said in our home, handicrafts are very important. This idea that the children would learn to make things, useful things, not just what you say, like paper and stick projects, or not something you'd make at story time at the library, but a true craft, handicraft, a handcraft. Often in our home, we will research a little about our activities and share the stories of the people who used skills like what we're learning. That's been these skills that have been passed down through the generations. Sometimes I can connect a handicraft to a specific family member because I recall seeing them do it when I was little, but more often I'm relying on the cultural idea behind the process. In other words, it could be something I know that our people or another group of people did, or just be something I think they may have done based on things I've heard or read. It's not really a science, it's more of an art. And with handicrafts, I think it's truly a matter of the heart. It's also an opportunity to expand your children, to get out of themselves, thinking of themselves and thinking of others instead, because we gift the things that we make. So on the right, you can see a museum exhibit of Gee's Bend quilts. And if you aren't familiar with these quilters, I don't have time today to go into it, but they're fascinating, and I would recommend that you get to know them and learn about them. But when we studied them and we visited this art museum, my daughter came home, and for that school year, she made a quilt. And I had suggested to her that she make a doll-sized quilt because she doesn't know how to quilt, and it's her first time, and we were going to be learning something new. But anybody who knows teens or preteens as well knows that they're not going to listen. And she was like, "Nope, my very first quilt is going to be queen sized." And she shut me up because that's exactly what she went and did. So again, that connection and that idea that she felt connected to people we had studied, people that she felt were similar to her and had a story that was partly her own, and she wanted to create in the way that they create. Foreign language is another idea or opportunity. And, here people are like, foreign language, how in the world is that? How can that be a place to add diverse perspective and to diversify our feast? When learning a language, our focus shouldn't just be about the mechanics of language acquisition, the pictures we use, the stories we provide, the songs and imagery we put before the children. All of these aspects of our language lessons are opportunities to share our own culture and the culture of others. Charlotte Mason asked a question in volume 2 of her work, and the question was, is there one subject that claims our attention more than the other? And she goes on to answer her own question, and she said that yes, there is a subject or a class of subjects which has an imperative moral claim upon us. And you can go on, and she talks a little bit more, and essentially what she says is that it's the duty of the nation to maintain relations of brotherly kindness with other nations, and therefore it is the duty of every family as an integral part of the nation to be able to hold brotherly speech with the families of other nations as opportunities arise. Therefore, to acquire the speech of neighboring nations is not only to secure an inlet of knowledge and a means of culture, but is a duty of higher morality. That's compelling and convicting. It's not just about getting credits for your transcript or meeting graduation requirements. It's not even about making yourself more marketable for some employer, but rather it's our duty, our moral duty, to be able to hold brotherly speech with others. So an example would be, this is a Senegalese child practicing French. One of my daughters is really into studying French, and when I told her that they speak French in Senegal, she was like, "What? I can't believe that." And I thought to myself, wow, she really has in her mind that French is only spoken in France, and what a fallacy that is, and what can I do to correct that? On the right, it's a picture book. I know some of you are like, we are classic interpreters and educators. We would never use something like this. But of course, children love picture books, and picture books also are filled with ideas. And this one in particular is written by an Afro-Latino author and illustrator, Eric Velasquez, and it's about an Afro-Latino family. And in it, the boy switches easily between English and Spanish. And we can see for a lot of children, it's their first time, a story like this is their first introduction to this idea of Afro-Latino. How can there be a family that looks Black, like I'm normally used to seeing Black people, but they speak Spanish? And it seems simple to us as adults, but for children, that's often new. What about reading practice? Before I wrap up, I'll have this last example. For those of you that work with young children, even our reading lessons present opportunities for our children to see themselves and their neighbors reflected. Most traditional early readers feature animals and or only white people. And that's difficult, especially older ones, which a lot of us use because of the richness of the vocabulary and the stories. And the problem comes in, not that there's a problem with those stories, those books, because I use those to teach my children to read. It's not that the books are a problem, it's that having only those books, that's the problem. So this is just an example of one that I found. It's Toby by Stella Gentry Sharp, and it's an older work, but it uses photography of a group of Toby, a group of Black boys and his brothers, and the farm that they live on, and the things that they do with their family. And so it's a real story. It's not silly. The silly pre-reading stories are not ones that I typically want to use, but it's a real story. It's about, could be about real people. And the author wrote it based on families in her community. So as I bring this to an end so that we can open up questions or we can have more of a discussion, I want to wrap up by saying that a diverse feast is not a second-rate one. It's not a second-rate version of the real feast. It's not a plan B for people of color or those who are different than a mainstream family in some other type of way. It's not a watering down of something that's true and good and beautiful. A diverse feast is the authentic meal served on the table of a life-giving home or a life-giving classroom. Limited interpretations have cheapened the meal to one of a processed, write and repeat list of acceptable books and songs and pictures and poems meant to kind of serve a one size fits all approach to what is really supposed to be a living and breathing idea filled passionate and diverse feast for education. It's an enlightened choice for parents and teachers who are desiring a more authentic and intentional path to raising children who feel valued and who thrive as passionate, open-handed lovers of people, of children who are loving their neighbors as they love themselves. So I talk about um, these topics, especially in my book, A Place to Belong, and it's available where books are sold, also aplacetobelongbook.com. And I have multiple chapters about books, about media that our children, the things we watch and listen to, the places we go, the friendships that we make, how our family spends our time, the things we discuss at the kitchen table, and all of the above. So thank you for your time. I want to open it up to us having a conversation.
Yes. And while I'm waiting for people to put their questions in, whew, that last, you know, the part they say in the black church when the pastor gets to the end of his sermon and he brings it home.
Yeah,
That was one of the, that was one of those bring it home points you were making when you said diversifying the feast is not a plan B. It's not a watered down version. It's not something we do separate for black people or other people of color. It is the feast.
right. That's
That,
important, I think, it's an important point to make because otherwise people start saying, well, that's okay for them, or but I need to make it clear that my suggestion isn't for them or for us, but
yes,
I'm saying that this is a premium option for all children.
all children, because they all need to know about one another. So many comments you made, like even a brotherly language, things like that. I mean, it's just again this whole rethinking, redefining classics. I think one of the things that really connected with what you're saying. I was when I was teaching classics at Howard, and I was my class is called Blacks and Classics, and all I do is just go through actual classic texts and point out that there are more people there than Europe. This is not me trying to make it black
Right.
or for people of color. It's in the text, or as you would say, in the feast. And I was sharing with them book 5 of Herodotus's The Histories when he talks extensively about Ethiopia.
Mm,
And I had classicists, like these are like retired, they're retired from teaching at the academic level. They would say things like, I have read that book so many times and I never saw it.
wow. That's so powerful.
And I appreciated their humility in saying that
Yeah.
because I went through something similar. I think somebody said, like when you started off this journey, you were just teaching, you were just trying to give good teaching until your daughter said, hey,
This is not working.
because of what, and that's what it means to redefine this tradition. If we look closely, it's actually in there. We actually do the work of erasing it out of there. The
Yeah,
feast is
it's true.
actually. Hmm.
I wanted to show something. I didn't make this comment in my presentation. I'm gonna go back one
Okay,
slide
yes,
to something to see if you guys noticed it. I want you to look here at what the children were painting. This is a painting of the girl with the pearl earring, a very famous painting, and I want you to see how one child painted her. It's very much like the actual painting, and another child. And then look at this picture here in the middle.
hmm
And I think my point in saying this is that we're not trying to do something to the kids. They will each interpret this work, these diverse works, in their own way, right? So
Yes.
we're not going to tell them, make sure you hear this and listen to this because this person of color said this and this person of color did this and now this was a white person, right? We're going to present just people. And why this particular child made the girl with the pearl earring Black, I can never tell you. She
Right.
never discussed it with me and didn't explain it. Why she didn't, I can never tell you. Those
Yes.
things are not important, but I think it's a, I think it's a point that I want to make that we're not telling them what to think. We're just
Yes.
expanding the pool of ideas that they can, and each and every child will take those ideas and synthesize them differently. Um,
Toni
so
Morrison
yeah,
say, was it Toni Morrison? I want to say it was Toni Morrison. She thought, was it The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe or a Shakespeare play? One of the two. She thought all the characters were, she did not realize they weren't black.
yeah,
Where I'm going where I'm going with that is that if we raise up a generation of people
yeah,
who understands that the classical tradition or this concept of the canon or all of these what we or call rich books that really are a feast, if they're presented in a way where they see the diversity like in the world, they will read them without that racial lens, without the whitewashing. And honestly, and I believe your thoughts connect to this. I actually disagree with blackwashing. I agree. Sometimes
yes,
we overcorrect.
yes,
People are going to have a hard time with what I'm saying. But the reason why I resist making any ethnic group or color or race the center of education is because
yes.
that means we dehumanize everyone else. And someone has asked a question connected to this
Okay.
that we that is connected to what I'm saying. How do we bring in diversity to schools and college classes in an equitable way where everyone is seen? You may have already addressed this, but I would love to you to speak to that specifically
Yeah,
again.
and that's why I wanted to make sure in the beginning I said a couple times I'm showing you examples from my own context and the reason in a presentation because I know what's authentic about myself. I feel most secure showing those examples, but to me there's not a prescription and to be honest, I think it requires prayer because you're asking the Holy Spirit to lead you into what you should share because how do I know what percentage of no one has a prescription written for me. I'm going to share Native Americans this many times and East Indian people this many times, and this time I'm going to go to Thailand next with my kids, and don't forget Nigeria. And it's not that, right? So, what I'm looking for is to expose myself as a teacher. I find that I'm not able to give my kids anything better than what I'm taking in. I'm trying to expose myself to as many different touch points. And if you think about a ladder, like I'm trying to grab onto all these different rungs myself. And so it could be very uneven. There are school years where we spend much more time learning about European people and their works. And some years it may look like we're skewing completely away from that. And for me, I prefer for things to happen naturally and I just want what I want to be intentional about is my openness to hearing from other people. But I don't have a quota, right? Because then it starts to feel inauthentic to me. And I think my kids will be able to tell. You're unmuted. Yeah.
What that, and I agree with you on that. I think what that means is, and I think the more we do that in a more organic and natural way, then our kids won't make such a big deal out of it. They'll just, you said it earlier in your talk, they'll just be looking for people and just human experiences.
But it
Um,
does require us behind the scenes right now because of the way things are. I am very intentional. But my work, it's like the Wizard of Oz. I'm Oz. I'm behind the curtain. And
yes,
I'm doing all the work over here. You know, I'm grinding out. I'm struggling because a lot of what I'm doing hasn't been done. But to my children, to the front, the front facing, I'm trying to present normalcy. And that's
normalcy.
why and people say, well, I've seen people, why is this so important? Like, let's take Shakespeare, for example. Everyone can see themselves in that. Yeah, sometimes you have to help them though. And
Yeah.
so if someone were to tell my kids Shakespeare's for old stuffy white people, they would be absolutely shocked because you
Yes.
cannot tell them. that they don't know. They know some Shakespeare. They laugh at the funny parts, they cry
My
with the
baby
sad
too.
parts,
Yeah.
but that is because no one's ever told them that it was not for them, and because we haven't drawn a line of demarcation between this is something they do and this is something we do. And I do
Yeah.
the same with diverse texts. I don't say, "Well, you're Black, so you should like this," and, white people probably won't like it as much. No, I don't engage in any of that. So I think that it's a really good point. And what underrepresented voices are you specifically trying to include? All of them.
Yep.
Women, people of color, people of differing abilities. I like different socioeconomics. I once read where a woman said her kids were shocked when they read a book where the family lived in an apartment. And I thought to myself, that's silly. And then I thought to myself, have my kids ever been in an apartment? I don't think they had been in an apartment.
Wow, diversity. You know what? What we're talking about here is because everyone is a little nervous about the word diversity. And I think this is a good point. We have a few minutes before we start the school leaders panel to define what do we mean by diversity. I don't mean it the way the political people mean it. I don't
Mm-mm.
mean it the way the culture means it. I mean the way it means in the dictionary, different,
Yes.
different
Yes.
backgrounds, different beliefs, different genders, different ethnicities, different. Just showing
Regional? I mean, I'm from Illinois and my children are
that
from Georgia. Let me
yes.
tell you, it's like another country, people.
Yep.
It's like right within our own country, regional differences, that counts in the diversity. The
Yes.
perspectives of generational,
Yes.
cross-generational, that they're exposed to the, old ideas and new ideas and realizing that there's nothing new under the sun and all of that. So I can't agree with you more. I think that the word I want to leave everyone with today is this idea of expansion. So
Yeah.
anytime you're asking yourself a question, is Amber talking about this or are we talking about this? If your idea is something that involves narrowing, then think that's not what we're talking about. But if the idea is something that talks about expansion, then you're on the path that we're discussing.
And okay, so the person in the Q&A, their specific question is all this that we're talking about, and she wants this for her children. What is the way? And this might be a conversation we have to continue on June 15th, everybody. But oh my gosh, I wish you were going to be there, Amber. But
I
anyway,
know.
but how do we phrase this conversation so these schools become more open to this and they're not thinking we're trying to um, remove, erase, cancel, that it really is a gracious, loving journey that welcomes everyone into this beautiful tradition, and all narratives and all conversations. What any suggestions on how to present this, how a parent can present this to their board in a way that they might be more receptive?
I think leading by example and
Mm,
also calling in reinforcements when you need to. I've been to many a school, right, to present to their teachers and to understand. Like when I show them the art, right, the visuals, those are important. Again, they look at that and they're like, oh, I see where she's coming from. I
yeah,
understand now. They're
mm,
scared, and fear can cause you to not want to try new things. You need to explain, and sometimes with visuals, and you need to bring in reinforcements of people who have done the thing and are doing it gracefully and well. And you need to pray before your meetings and ask for help and favor to help people to see the truth.
yes. Amber, this was a wonderful talk. You gave us
Thank
such
you.
practical advice for this. I want to thank you so much for being
Thank you
willing
for
to be here with us. I will be up. I can't wait to upload this because so everyone can hear it. I am right now, as you've been talking, some of the videos are now up on our channel at Redefining Classics on YouTube. You can also get a link to our YouTube channel on our website, redefiningclassics.org. And then all you have to just is click the YouTube link at the top, and you'll see that the videos are starting to be uploaded. It's taking a long time, but they're coming. So we look forward to having that. We are right now, we don't have a time for a break because we're going right into the school leaders panel. And Diana is, I think, on the guest side. I'm going to resend you the panel link, Diana, so you can join us on the panel's side. And on the school leaders panel, we will have David Within, Brian Whitchurch, This conversation will be moderated by Chris Perrin, founder of Classical Academic Press. I'm really excited about this conversation where I'm sure he's going to ask some great questions about ways that we invite everyone to this great conversation. So we're going to give everyone like a couple of minutes, those who are coming, a couple of minutes to get on the panelist side. So just give us a minute while we turn that around. I'm going to stop this to recording.